Hello, this is the my artifact episode number 4136. Today's date is 3rd of July 2026. It has been almost like a night at 10:42 p.m. I just exhaust everything. Okay, like after I went to number 2, then after that it kind of like a feel like very lighter. I don't know how I supposed to explain this thing, but yeah, I feel really good. Okay, yeah. Okay, let's just jump into the question. Let's go. Alright, so question is, what specific event or piece of information made you start comparing? Oh, okay. First of all, what exactly is this question, and why am I asking this question to myself? Well, just a couple of hours ago, I watched a video about how to increase your wealth 10x. Okay, yeah. And they kind of like give the formula, and this kind of like a formula is actually depend on this question. Okay, I will not gonna talk about the formulas and things and that, but this kind of like a question is kind of like a tell us the reality that am I applying that formula in my life to become that particular person or not, or will I able to be kind of like a increase my wealth 10x higher or not. It depends on when I ask this question. All right, so let's just jump in. All right, yeah. Now regarding about this question, is a kind of like a very difficult to understand. Let me explain. What specific event or piece of information made you start comparing? Example, it says saw a friend promotion on LinkedIn, heard a relative praise your cousin, saw your friend vacation post on Instagram. These are kind of like a somewhat something question. Like basically, let me explain even more kind of like a simplified. Okay, the question says, why do I have this habit of comparing things, and exactly when and how did it start? Okay, first of all, do I have habit of comparing? Well, basically is this thing actually we are not just I have a habit, everyone have a habit of comparing. Okay, first of all, if you don't really understand the meaning of comparison, let me explain to you in simplified way. Okay, yeah. One particular person kind of like get a mark in unit test 10 out of 9. Another person kind of like get a mark 10 out of 7. Who is a smarter? The particular person who get a mark 10 out of 9 is actually smarter because he has a higher score. Simple thing. All right, yeah. So basically that is called comparison. You are comparing particular person regarding about their academic credibility that they have and things and that. Okay, yeah. But comparison is not just happen in academic. Comparison happen in everywhere. Wealth, money, social status, things and that. But why do we compare? Like what is exactly the reason for that? Well, basically it's this thing, comparison is a kind of like a very essential part of our human growth. If you're not really understanding the context, I'm kind of like a simplified to kind of like give you example. First of all, when humans are born, like not just born, like when humans, I'm talking about the kind of like early evolution, when the humans are actually kind of like a surviving, he cannot able to be survive in the wilderness. Why? He cannot run faster, he cannot fly, he cannot have strength, he cannot climb the tree. He can climb, but probably almost, yeah. Well, we became from monkey, but still is this thing that we are very vulnerable to kind of like a saving our life. because other animals are kind of like a very crazy regarding about their, they have strength, they could have fly, they would have big fur. We don't even have fur. We can't even kind of like a barely survive in winters and things and that and that. So basically, from every other point of perspective, humans are very, very vulnerable. They are meant to be killed, literally meant to be killed. Okay, but every species has a kind of like a one goal, sorry, two goal actually, to survive and reproduce. Okay, now basically is this thing, we are trying to survive because in the wilderness it is kind of like a very difficult to survive. Now how do we supposed to be survive, because we don't really have anything at all to kind of like simply survive ourselves. So basically this thing we found human to human example, a one person cannot able to be survive in wilderness, survival rate is 0%. But when two people are came together, the survival rate is 20%. Yeah, like literally from 0 to 20. When three people came, survival rate 30. Four people came, survival rate 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, 100. Basically is this thing, we are kind of like a somebody surviving. So basically having more people, that means we are kind of like a survive, our chances of being survival is kind of like a became much more higher. Okay, yeah. So that's why humans have started living together with other humans, and it is very much essential. Because of that, when humans are started living together, we became social animal. Now what is exactly the social animal, what exactly it means? Well, have you seen ants? Okay, ants. Okay, ants are kind of like a social animal too, like social insects, if I'm gonna say that. Okay, like the one ant barely even survive, there is nothing really at all. But the millions of ants are live together in a colony, their survival rate is kind of like a became more higher. And that's a kind of like a simply the every tiny animals or fishes or any organism are survive like that way, not just a human, but as a fish, as a bird. Like have you ever kind of like a seen a fish who is a kind of like a simply that key, kind of like a somebody like a diving together, hundreds of fish. Why? Because of that their survival rate is kind of like a became more higher in the predator of the ocean and things and that and that. Okay, yeah. Same goes with the birds. Birds kind of like a their survival rate is kind of like a became more higher when they are kind of like a flying together. Okay, so basically this is kind of like a things. The evolution is always try to meant to be survive, and they always try to find a way to survive. So as human does the same thing, we are also kind of like a started living together, and we became social animal. Now, basically, is this thing, the ants are social animal, social insects, the birds and fish are kind of like a things and that and that. But in human, things are very much complicated. Why? Because we are human and we have a brain. Okay, and we are started thinking, and that's a kind of like a things that the social animal became kind of like a something very much, I don't know. Let me explain. So basically, my question is that when we are kind of like started comparing ourselves, since we are kind of like started living together, we are kind of like a simply living together. So that means we have to be survive. That means we have to bring the food and things and that and that. Now, basically, let's just say a kind of like a simply a group of people. Let's just say a clan, maybe how almost like a 20 people. Now, obviously, in the 20 people, not everyone is kind of like a going to the hunt. If everyone are kind of like a going to the hunt, then probably they will kind of like a scattered and things and that and that. And another thing is that ki, even after they hunt, they have to be kind of like somebody have a shelter, because shelter is really essential. Okay, yeah, because we are not kind of like a survive from kind of like a something just animal. We are surviving from like a weather and kind of like a brutal weather and things and that and that. So someone should supposed to be stay in the shelter, so that shelter would protected, and some of the people will kind of like a go to the hunting and kind of like a bring the food. Structure created, job created. Some people went to the kind of like hunting, some people stay in a shelter to protect the shelter. Basically, women are kind of like a stay in shelter. Why? Because women are very vulnerable. They are kind of like a getting pregnant. They are not really that much strong enough. They are not capable enough to kind of like a go and hunt. So they are kind of like a stay in shelter. The men are stronger. They are not getting pregnant and things and that. So they are kind of like a went to go to the wilderness, kind of like a hunting. Basically, our evolution is actually started from that way. All right. Now, basically, what exactly happened? That ki when kind of like a couple of people went to the kind of like a hunting, they are kind of like hunting, bringing the food and things and that. Because of this thing, those people bringing the food, and because of the food, everyone is kind of like a survive. So those people who are kind of like a going to the hunting, those became higher than people who are kind of like a living in shelter. Okay, yeah. Because let me tell you one thing now. The important thing is that survive, and survive actually came from survival cell and get a food. Okay, yeah. Now person who kind of like a something that ki provide both kind of like a survival and food, that particular person became higher than rest of the people or in the rest of the clan. So the people who kind of like went into the hunting, they will become higher authoritarian. The people who are kind of like living in shelter, kind of like a little less authoritarian. Do you understand the concept? Same apply over here in today's world too. Okay, yeah. Since then, status created. Okay, yeah. Do you understand? Status created. The person who kind of like went into the kind of like a hunting, kind of like a bigger than the person who kind of like stay in shelter. All right. Now, because of this thing, higher and lower is actually created. Since the group will kind of like become bigger, then kind of like things get kind of like a much more crazy. Like basically is this thing, when the group is kind of like a much more become bigger, survival rate is kind of like a much more higher. But when the survival rate is kind of like a much more higher, and the multiple people are kind of like living into the clan or group, it is really required a kind of like a discipline, or really required a kind of like a structure, that how should supposed to be clan or group perform or kind of like survive themselves. They need a rule, and who will kind of like give them rule? A leader, right? So basically is this thing, a leader kind of like create a structure regarding about how the group will kind of like survive and get a food and things and that. And that structure create the hierarchy. Okay, the leader will become king, the sub leader who kind of like is only managing things, the people who are kind of like that. Do you understand? It create the structure, a human structure regarding about who is actually valuer than rest of the things and that. It create the hierarchy. All right, yeah. Do you understand? This kind of like a create a structure like who is kind of like a much more bigger and who is kind of like a much less bigger, or maybe kind of like a not bigger, right? It create a kind of like a structure. Now, do you understand? We are kind of like a creating a structure. So since we are kind of like a create the structure, create the hierarchy, then comparison started creating. Okay, how does kind of like a comparison will gonna start? Okay, like basically how this comparison is actually started. Okay, yeah, because we created the structure, na. So basically the like it is really essential for the group and clan, okay, to kind of like have a proper structure, right? Yeah, that is true, but every action comes with the consequences. Good consequences, bad consequences too. Good consequences, they are survive more, which is good consequences. Bad consequences, they are started comparing. But comparison, it is also not a wrong consequences or bad consequences. No, it is also a good consequences too. Let me kind of like explain to you in simple language. A particular people, like let's just say a kind of like a two group of clan. Okay, yeah, clan A, clan B. Okay, yeah. In the clan A, almost like a 25 people. Clan B, almost like a 20 people. Right? Now, basically, what is actually happened? Both clan are kind of like only try to survive. Okay, yeah. Now, how they will gonna survive? Okay, how they will gonna survive? To kind of like bring the food and things and that. Now, basically, the clan A kind of like did something very crazy. What does they did? Instead of kind of like running, they decided to kind of like invent a wheel, and because of they kind of like create a wheel, they are kind of like a somebody just go forward and things and that, or maybe like wheel is kind of like a very much kind of like a things. Sorry. Okay, scrap the wheel. Okay, clan A and clan B. So basically what exactly happened, both clan are kind of like a surviving, both clan is kind of like a bringing the food, sharing the food with the rest of the people in the clan. Now basically clan A have a kind of like a, like basically on that thing there is a kind of like a problem. What is actually problem? You have to bring the food and you have to eat the food. Okay, yeah, you cannot store, or maybe if you kind of like a store, then possibly that food will kind of like a something that key is spoiled or things, or yeah, like there is nothing really at all. Okay, so basically what exactly happened, that clan A who kind of like did something crazy, they invented a fire, and because of the fire they are cooking the food, they are cooking the meal. And because because of they are kind of like assembly cooking the meat, cooking the food, so food will kind of like a look little bit tastier. Okay, like it kind of like a like bit little bit tasty. Okay, and it will not get spoiled, or maybe something that key it is kind of like a much more better because of that key heat, because of this kind of like a something the fire. In the in the cold winter they are kind of like a survive more. So let me tell you one thing, because of the innovation clan A is actually survive, clan B didn't really survive. Why? Because they are kind of like a stick with the kind of like old methodology to live the life. Okay, yeah, and because of clan B didn't really survive, they kind of like a died because of the cold weather, not because of the having no food. They have a food, but probably is this thing that they cannot able to be protect themselves in the cold winter and things and that. Okay, yeah, so basically is this thing, the people who are kind of like a innovate something, their survival rate is kind of like a much more higher. Okay, yeah, now let's talk about the comparison. Now do you understand? Now I'm kind of like a not explain to you in proper language, or maybe kind of like a something my explanation kind of like a things very much kind of like a fragile, but still. Okay, yeah, now I mention clan A, clan B. Clan B is a kind of like a assembly disappear, but there is also clan C too. Okay, yeah, now those clan C are kind of like a somebody learn from clan A, and whatever they did, they kind of like a somebody invent like a so as kind of like a clan A kind of like invented the fire, they also kind of like invented the fire, or they are kind of like started creating fire. And because of this thing, they, because of the comparison, they evolved them, and because of they evolved them, clan A and clan C evolved, survive. Clan B didn't really survive, they died because of the cold winter. Okay, do you understand? So sometime comparison is a kind of like a very much essential tool to upgrade yourself. Okay, yeah, it's very kind of like a difficult to understand the comparison, but let me kind of like explain to you in even more simple language in modern world point of view. Okay, yeah. So let's just say you are kind of like a join your office, and basically it's this thing that key you are kind of like started working there for almost like a year, you are kind of like working there, everything's really good. Now basically what exactly happened, some people are kind of like a buy the iPhone, okay, which is kind of like a very expensive phone. By the way, in Indian context point of perspective, in US and Europe probably this is kind of like a very much common for them, but in India iPhone is kind of like a very expensive product. Okay, yeah, now people are kind of like buying that product. Now basically it's just saying this is the very expensive, and probably their salary cannot afford to buy that particular product, but still those people buy that Apple product. Now you are kind of like somebody, because of everyone are kind of like using the Apple phone, you are also kind of like a thing that why I cannot use that Apple phone too. Okay, yeah, but like basically is this thing, what kind of like Apple phone is actually providing value that Android phone doesn't? Like nothing really at all. Like, does it camera good? No, the Android camera is much more better. Does the processor good? No, like basically the Android processor is actually much more better. Like basically Android is kind of like a providing much more higher value than Android. Sorry, Android is kind of like a much more value than Apple, right? So it doesn't really make sense to buy Apple phone. then why does kind of like a people are buying the Apple phone? Is because of the status, because Apple product is a represent as a status, how much rich they are, because of they are kind of like affording the expensive phone, and they are kind of like showing to the world, because of I am afford to buy expensive phone, I am rich. Okay, yeah. And this is kind of like a simply comparison start, because as I mentioned, the hierarchy, because of that people who are kind of like a simply higher, they wanted to kind of like represent they are higher than other. How they do that, how they present that, by wearing kind of like a something better, or kind of like a, yeah, like a golden jewelry or golden kind of like a things or whatever it is, to kind of like a look them kind of like a much more bigger than rest of the things. In previous era, the gold or kind of like a wearing jewelry was a kind of like a thing to showing they are kind of like a much more higher. In modern era, is a kind of like a owning Apple phone would be a kind of like a something, a kind of like a sharing they are kind of like a much more value and things and that and that. Now, do you understand? Na? Like the comparison is a kind of like a very much essential for the growth, is because of that ki these comparison are let you force you to innovate stuff. Okay, let me tell you one thing. Who is the mother of invention? Yeah, who is the mother of invention? Necessity is the mother of invention. And when that necessity will gonna came, we already talked about the previous example. Clan B didn't really think that we should supposed to be invent the fire or things and that and that. Okay, yeah. So they died, but Clan C need that they need to invent the fire. Okay, yeah. Okay, so they kind of like invent the fire or copy from the Clan A to kind of like invent the fire, and because of their survive. So basically, need is a kind of like innovation of mother of innovation. Okay, so when there is a need, innovation actually happened. And the people who kind of like stick with the old kind of like some rules and things and that, they will not gonna survive. So let me tell you one thing: we are a social animal. Our evolution actually come from the evolution or growth is actually come from the necessity, which is kind of like a based on the comparison and things and that. Like basically, let me tell you one thing: in today's world, same thing actually happened. Let's just say a kind of like a United States or US is a kind of like one of the most powerful country in the world, not just because of he has a military or things and that, but their living standard is kind of like a much more better. They are kind of like a have kind of like a really good homes, streets, and really everything's kind of like a really good. Their education system is really good, healthcare system is really good, their infrastructure is kind of like a much more better than India and things and that. So because of that country, they are kind of like experiencing really good life and things and that we are comparing them, and because of we are comparing them, we are also kind of like a build the infrastructure, building a road, building a kind of like a better school, better healthcare and things and that we compare, we understand the need, and from that need we innovate stuff. Okay, yeah. So comparison is very much essential. It kind of like a build inside of you. It's kind of like a evolution. It's kind of like evolution, and because of this thing, we kind of like evolved by the comparison. Now, comparison is a kind of like a somewhat something happened really good in emotion, in human point of view, in a kind of like a in if you kind of like a look at the human from universal scale or maybe world scale. Okay, yeah. But if you kind of like a look into the personal point of perspective, then comparison is a somewhat something not right. Why? Because sometimes comparison is not really right thing. Why is that? Because it kind of like a push you to kind of like a spend more money in such a thing that kind of like you don't really need that stuff and things and that. But still is this that na ki I am not kind of like a blaming the comparison, okay, or anything kind of like that, because I believe that ki if I buy the iPhone, okay, because of my friend actually buy and things and that, does it add any kind of like a value inside of me? No. But because of I am feeling that ki it add inside of my value, my behavior change. What do you mean by that? Example, let's just say a kind of like a something is this thing that ki you are dying. Okay, yeah, you are kind of like a somebody dying and things and that, No, basically what is actually happened that ki doctor said that ki kind of like a something that ki like a like a I don't know, it's a kind of like a thing, placebo effect. Okay, what's exactly the placebo effect? Okay, let me explain. It's a kind of like a things. Okay, it's a kind of like a things that na ki when you are kind of like a believing something, that something will kind of like create hope inside of you, or faith inside of you, and because of that hope or faith, it kind of like create a kind of like a something purpose of you, and you are kind of like a think that "Ki this is actually happened because of I have a hope in that thing." God is a kind of like a really good example. God is a kind of like a things, believe in God is a kind of like exist is because of that ki we need that hope. Human doesn't really have any hope. Crimes, people are dying, the wars and things and that and that. Oh my God, rain is actually happening. Okay, okay. So because of that, I have to be stop here. Okay, it's a kind of like a rain. There is no way to kind of like simply cover by myself. There is no umbrella and things and that and that. But still, this is kind of like a very small portion. But no, I have to wait. Sorry, the rain is actually happened. Okay, so comparison is a kind of like a thing. If you do it too much, make sure that you will not kind of like a lose the um, lose the what is actually word for that, um, asset and liability. Make sure that whatever you are spending should supposed to be, make sure that those are liability, not a sorry, those are not a liability. It should supposed to be asset. All right. So if you think that perspective, then it's really good. Thank you.